Believe it or not, we are already a quarter of the way through 2025. I'm not on pace for my reading goal at all, but I have a whole bunch of books I've read that I'm excited to talk to you about today. Hi, I'm Amanda, and this is Spineless Books, your one-stop shop for all things audiobook. Now, I've attempted 19 books so far, 2 DNFs, 1 in progress, and the other 16 fully finished, and I'm going to tell you about all 19, well, not the in progress book, I'll tell you about 18 books today. Currently, I'm a little bit off my projection of my reading goal of roughly 80 books per year. I'm on pace for more like 60, but here's the truth. It's just a suggestion. It's really not a big deal. And I have a lot of time off during the summer, so I might kind of up that number. But I also have a lot of really big books I'd like to read this year, so we'll see how it goes. And if I don't hit 80, I don't hit 80. Big deal. I'm going to go through all of the books in the order that I read them. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I'll give you a little bit of a plot summary, and then I'll tell you what I rated it and kind of what I'm thinking about it. First up, we have The Voyage of the Damned by Frances White, narrated by Nathan Fode. Now, Voyage of the Damned is almost like if Agatha Christie wrote a fantasy mystery novel with a murder. The book follows 12 individuals who have the ability to potentially inherit the province of Concordia. All of them are heirs, and all of them are in some way blessed with a magical ability, except our main character, Ganymedes. Now, Ganymedes has a blessing, except he really doesn't. So he's basically trying to fake it till he makes it on this ship with 12 other heirs. Now, of course, plot twist, there's a murder. So it turns into every man for himself, but it's not just every man for himself, it's every man and his blessing for himself. So things get really complicated and really convoluted. Now, I really liked this one, but I also felt like there were parts of it that I didn't really love. It got slow in a few parts. I mean, this is sort of like a TikTok sensation. I think it's a great book for a YA book. I'm not entirely sure it's classified as YA, but it read like a YA book. Ganymedes is a very unreliable narrator. He's simultaneously really intriguing and really likable, but also kind of deplorable, and that made him kind of a fun character to follow. I did like the book. I didn't love the book. For me, this book was a solid 3.5. It didn't quite rise to the level of a 4, but it held my interest, and I did like it, and I don't know, it was a unique one. Interestingly enough, this was a debut novel, so I would be curious about more from this author. HappyHead by Josh Silver was narrated by Hugh Parmenter. It follows a young man named Sebastian whose family is pretty convinced he has depression. Now, from Sebastian's perspective, that might not quite be accurate, but he accepts entrance into a program called HappyHead, which is a facility for teens to overcome depression. So he goes to sort of appease his family, and as soon as he gets there, it's very clear things are not quite right. All of the young people are put into teams, and they're given challenges that range from like really silly and juvenile to basically life-threatening. So quickly, Sebastian figures out he has to get out of there. He spends most of the book figuring out who his allies are, who his enemies are, and exactly what he's going to do about his situation. The book ended on a cliffhanger, and I was immediately sure that I was going to read book 2. This next book, Dead Happy, has just come out, and I haven't gotten my hands on it yet, but I'm really excited. It was pretty thrilling for a YA novel, and I found Sebastian to be an interesting character who I liked following. I liked Josh Silver's writing a lot, and this book for me was a solid 4.5, so I'm really looking forward to the sequel. Good Material by Dolly Alderton was narrated by Vanessa Kirby and Arthur Darvill, although Arthur Darvill does the bulk of the narration. It follows a guy who's just had a breakup, and it's the kind of breakup where like you don't ever expect it to happen and you think that you're with this person for the rest of your life and then suddenly you're not. Now, I heard that this book was super funny, but it turns out that his job of a stand-up comedian in the story is actually kind of it. I mean, there are funny parts for sure, but it's not really ha-ha funny like I was expecting. In fact, it's much more a portrait of male grief that I found unusual in that I haven't seen many portrayals of it like that. Now, as this character goes through that sort of feeling of emptiness that you often have after a breakup, he has to also redefine himself without his longtime girlfriend. So it's a really interesting story. It is funny, but it's not ha-ha funny like you might expect. But I think this one was pretty good. I liked it. I enjoyed it. It kept me interested. It was a solid 4 for me, but really interesting premise. The Road by Cormac McCarthy is narrated by Tom Stettschulte. Now, many people know this book. I mean, essentially, it's a modern classic. It's set in a post-apocalyptic world, and essentially it's a father and son navigating daily life where there are high highs, low lows, and tons of challenges. You really don't know how they got in the situation or what happened. The book just sort of begins in their present day. And there are so many heartbreaking moments and triumphant moments and really raw moments. A lot of people find this book really difficult. I found myself impacted by the book, although reading it itself didn't really fluster me. Some people I know have a really hard time getting through it, but it's a pretty quick read and it's a really interesting story. And I really kind of liked the nature of it where you don't know how you're in this situation and you don't know what's going to happen afterwards, but it's just a portrait in time of this really difficult situation. This book was a solid 5 for me, no questions asked. All Fours, written and narrated by Miranda July, was my first DNF this year. Now, here's the deal. This book is really odd, and the perspective of the main character is really odd. I tried really hard to like this book. I'd heard good things, but I'd also heard mixed things. And as I was reading, I just found myself kind of dreading turning on the audiobook. Usually that's not a good sign. So I gave it a good while. I got about a quarter of the way into the book and I just wasn't feeling it. So I decided to pause. And then I went to a book club book that I had to read. So I basically put the book down altogether. When I finished the book club book, which took me a little while, I realized I really didn't want to go back to it. I found the main character to be kind of deplorable. And not in like a, I want to know more about what it's like to live this way kind of way, in like a, I really don't want to be around you and I don't like who you are kind of way. Now, I'm sure there's more to the story than that, but I just felt like I really didn't have the energy to go past it. So I know a lot of people who really loved this book and thought it was super unique, but for me, I don't know, there was just something about it that was off-putting in a way that I didn't want to move past. There are so many good books. It's not worth reading the ones that you're not enjoying. And for me, this one just didn't do it. So if you liked it, please tell me why in the comments because I'm curious. I read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith for the first time this year. I read it narrated by both Kate Burton and Carrington McDuffie, though not at the same time. I had such a hard time with this book that I actually changed editions halfway through, hoping that a change of narrator might pick it up for me. This is a portrait of immigrating to the US at the turn of the century and what it was like to grow up and be poor and not have a lot of opportunity and sort of help one generation advance over the next. It's a really important story and it's a well done story, but there was something about the writing of this book that really kind of gave me a hard time. I didn't love the way it was written. I didn't love the voice. I didn't love the narrator. I didn't really love anything about it. But oddly enough, when I finished it, I felt like, wow, I'm kind of glad I read that. I also got a ton out of it at my book discussion. So it was a really interesting story to sort of have a love-hate relationship with. I didn't enjoy reading it, but I felt like it was worth a rating of a 4. So it's interesting to me when a book can have an impact on you, even if you kind of don't like reading it. And this is one I'm glad I read. I know I will never pick this book up again. Like, this is definitely one that was one and done for me, but I kind of am fascinated by people who say it's their favorite book. If that's you, I'd love to hear why you love it. Again, for me, it just didn't feel like that kind of book, even though I found it valuable. But I would love to know what people think about it and why for them it's a favorite, because I do know plenty of people for whom that's the case. The Lifecycle of the Common Octopus by Emma Knight is narrated by Saskia Marleveld. I really like this book. This is kind of what I would describe as realistic fiction. It's a story of a family going through a situation and how they respond. It's definitely an unusual story and it got my attention, but I really like books like that. I would actually compare this book just a little bit to Hello Beautiful. It's not in any way a similar story, but just that whole realistic, believable family drama, that's what they have in common. But I feel like if you like a book like that, you might like a book like this. It follows a young girl who grew up in Canada and decides that she's going to go to Scotland for college. Her parents have gone through a nasty divorce, and she's pretty convinced that they're hiding something from her. She's also pretty convinced that the key to that is in Scotland. So when she gets there, she connects with an old friend of her father's, and essentially the entire story unravels from there. I really liked the characters in this one. I really liked the gray areas in this one, and I really liked the writing. It's really cool that this is Emma Knight's first novel, and I would definitely read more of her books, although I'll be honest, her cookbooks are not on my list of reads. But I enjoyed it, and I gave it a 4.5. I think it's a great book club pick. Orbital by Samantha Harvey is narrated by Sarah Nowdy. It won the Booker Prize in 2024. It's a relatively short read, and it's about 6 different astronauts and their experience in space. I think this is a little bit more a portrait of loneliness and isolation than it is of space travel, and I found the book to be lacking a narrative. In truth, I enjoyed it, but I really enjoyed the writing. I found as far as following a narrative, however, that this one was one where I really easily drifted in and out of consciousness. A number of times while listening to the audiobook, I found that I didn't really remember who I was hearing about or what I was supposed to know about that person, and I got lost a few times. There was a lot of backtracking in this one, and even though it was short, it took me a while to get through. Like I said, I really liked the writing. I thought it was really well done and really intriguing, but as a book, I think you could skip this one. I did give it a 4, but it's not a 4 I would recommend. The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai was narrated by Michael Crouch. It follows 2 people and many other characters as the beginning of the AIDS crisis unfolds. One character's story is set in 1985, and the other character's story is set in 2015. So 30 years apart, you get sort of an understanding of the serious impact that this crisis had on the communities that it first devastated. And it's not just about the health impact either, it's about the emotional impact and the familial impact that this disease had on so many. This is a really important book, but it is definitely not a pick-me-up. I've read Rebecca Mackay's other book, I Have Some Questions for You, and I really like that book. I think the thing that these 2 books have in common is simply nostalgia. They're both set in a time and place and reflect on a time and place with pretty impressive detail. I like her writing, and I really feel glad that I read this book. It opened up some important questions for me that I hadn't really thought about how things were for people who were living with AIDS in the 80s. Now, again, it's a downer, and it's definitely not one that's for everyone. I feel like it was an important read, but not really an enjoyable read. For me, this was a 4-star book, but not one I'll pick up again. Two Twisted Crowns is the second book in the Shepherd King series by Rachel Gillig. It's narrated by Lisa Corleone. Now, many of you know I had a huge problem with One Dark Window. I found the entire first half utterly boring, but I stuck it out and I was really, really rewarded. I don't know why that book was so bad in the first half to me, but I really loved where it went in the end and it got really intriguing. Two Twisted Crowns drops you right in the middle of the action, and it had none of the problems that the first book had. In fact, I would say Two Twisted Crowns was significantly better than One Dark Window. This was a solid 4 for me, but it was fast-paced and action-packed. If you've read One Dark Window, I would quickly grab this one, because I think you'll find that it is significantly better and way improved over the first book. I'm really glad that I followed through with the series, because I really liked this second one a lot. Blood Over Brighthaven is a dark academia fantasy novel by M.L. Wong. It's narrated by Moira Quirk, who I thought was fantastic. This is a really interesting book in that it follows a young woman named Siona who lives in a city called Tehran. Now, Tehran is governed by academics. Once every 10 years, they offer an opportunity for one woman to take a test for a position as a high mage. There's only 100 positions. So one woman given one chance every decade is really pretty sparse. Siona Freynan gets that chance and passes. Tehran has no idea what it's in for when she becomes a high mage, because as soon as she gets into that position, things go wild. I don't want to spoil anything for you, but I do want to tell you that this book was a huge surprise for me. It had me on the edge of my seat. I loved every single page of it, and it really, from beginning to end, was flawless in my opinion. This was one of the easiest 5 stars I've ever given. In fact, if I could have given it more than 5, I probably would have. This is one I will 100% read again and really, really enjoyed. In fact, I would probably willingly read it again today, even though I read it not very long ago. You should definitely check this one out if that's your genre. The Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor is narrated by Eunice Wong. This is a weird one. It's not really a sci-fi fantasy. It's sort of like a reality of today and then some weird situations. So it feels like a very grounded in reality sci-fi novel. It follows a woman who's isolated on an island with just an android to talk to, and she is working on figuring out how humans can communicate with an octopus. Now, the science part of it's really interesting, and then there's sort of a political part and an ethical part and all kinds of stuff like that, but the premise of this book really intrigued me, and honestly, the book just didn't give me what I needed. I felt like this book was a 3.5 at best. It wasn't that the writing wasn't good, because it was, and it wasn't that the structure wasn't good, because it was. It just didn't do enough with this really cool idea to get me engaged. The whole time I kept feeling like, isn't there more to this? And there wasn't. I'd pass on this one. The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown is narrated by Miranda Raisin. I really like this book. Now, in the end, I rated it a 4.5, and I usually rate immediately after I finish. I don't know what would have made this book a 5, but I feel like, as I've been thinking about it since I finished it, it keeps coming back up for me. So I think if I had to re-rate it, I might give it a 5. It felt a little better than a 4.5. It's a really cool story. It follows a young girl named Cassie who's gifted a book that happens to be magical. The Book of Doors that she receives allows her to travel through any door, anywhere, and any time. Now, it's not the only magical book out there, and as she enters this world of magical books, she learns that there is a whole lot of drama and a whole lot of strife. But I really love the way Gareth Brown structured this book. It was very intriguing. It was extremely complicated, but it was really clear. And I think as a debut novel, he's someone I'm definitely going to look into and follow for more, because I really like this book, and it's kind of hard to believe it's a first novel. I would highly recommend The Book of Doors, and even though past tense me gave it a 4.5, I'd say it's actually a 5 for me. Sipsworth by Simon Van Boy is narrated by Christine Rendell. It's a really cute story about an older woman named Helen Cartwright who's been living in Australia for several decades. Now that she's lost her husband and her only son, she decides she's going to move back to the area where she grew up in England and basically wait to die. Everything gets turned upside down, however, when she inadvertently allows a mouse into her house. Now, I don't want to spoil anything for you about this book. It's very simple, and it's extremely charming, and it's really wonderful. It's a pretty quick read, too. So if you're looking for a palate cleanser or just something to shake things up that's not going to take you too long, this is pretty much a win-win. I think you'll really enjoy it, and it's just super sweet. For me, this was a 5-star. One of the book clubs I participate in focuses exclusively on classics, and recently we read The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Tim Robbins, who I was really excited about, but it was okay. Now, I know I read this book in high school, or at least I was assigned part of it. I didn't really remember the plot, even though I know I read it, and I know I saw the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't know why it was so forgettable for me, but rereading it was definitely interesting. My book club had a ton to dig into in conversation, but one of the questions that came up for us towards the end of this book was, why is this still read as a classic in schools today? Now, in my opinion, I think there's a lot to get out of the book, but I think it's better suited to have conversation with adults than with teenagers. There's just something about it that for me doesn't really land for teens, and I know a lot of the teenagers that I teach have said that they didn't really love this one or even get it. So it's interesting, but I'm glad I revisited it. I didn't love it. I would say it's a 4, but maybe not quite a 4, but it definitely made for cool discussion. I don't know that I would recommend this to anybody. It's kind of a weird, very small, very simple story that has a lot of impact, but I think I'm okay without it. Sorry, F. Scott. The Last Bookshop by Evie Woods has 3 separate narrators. I'm not going to name them all here, I have them all detailed in my full video, but it's an interesting story. It essentially follows 2 people, a young man and a young woman in present day, and then another woman in the 1920s. They're all connected through the Lost Bookshop, which is a bookshop that seems to only appear when you need it. Now, there's a lot of interesting stuff in this book, and there's a lot to talk about and a lot of kind of heavy themes. They're handled somehow lightly in a way that's really interesting. I liked this book a lot. I didn't love it. I would say it was about a 3.5 for me, but I would be interested in more from this author. I thought the structure was intriguing. I thought her writing was good, and I really felt like something about it made me want to stick with it, and I wanted to know what would happen. I found I cared a lot. It just, in the end, didn't really come to that great of a conclusion to me. So, again, a solid 3.5 and a 3.5 I would recommend. It would make a fantastic book club read. I read Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler recently, and I was so excited when I realized that the narrator was Lynn Thigpen. Now, I don't know how many of you watched Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, but she was the chief, so she definitely had a special place in my heart and in my childhood. That said, this is a really bleak, depressing, post-apocalyptic novel, and it's interesting in that we follow a young woman who's growing up in that situation from childhood through to adulthood. While we're following her, not only is she figuring out how to do things in this situation, then how to do things on her own in this situation, then how to figure out who can be allies in this situation, but she's also basically inventing a philosophy, or you could call it a religion, as she goes. This book for me was a slog. I liked it. I'm glad I read it. I got a lot out of it, but the actual process of listening to the book, and it wasn't because of the narration, just felt slow and monotonous. Not a lot happens in this book. As a friend of mine said, it's almost like you have to eat your book vegetables before you can get to the meat. I don't know how much meat this book had, but there were a whole lot of vegetables. I'm not going to go on with this series. I know there are additional books in the series, but I think I'm done with this one. I liked it. I didn't love it. I gave it a 4, but barely. Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, narrated by Moira Quirk. Oof. I have to tell you, this was one of the most challenging books I have ever put down. I DNF'd this book. It's a 17-hour audiobook, and I DNF'd it about 12 hours in. I was way past the halfway point. I don't know what it was about this book. I love the writing, the story was interesting, the characters were cool, the humor was great, and I just couldn't get into it. I can't explain why. I liked everything about this book, but somehow it didn't grab me. And I found it was just taking me forever to get through, and I wasn't excited about it. And when I'm not excited to listen to a book, it tells you something. I know a lot of people love this book. It's got great ratings. I would love for someone to tell me why this book is so great, because for me, for some reason, I just never found my rhythm with it. Now, this is one that I will be honest and say I may reattempt at some point, but I don't know if it was wrong place, wrong time, or what. I could not get into Gideon the Ninth. It follows a young woman who, named Gideon, by the way. I thought Gideon would be a guy, but Gideon's a girl. And essentially what's happening is this. There are 9 houses. Every house has a necromancer, and the necromancers are going to a location to be challenged with their best swordswoman or their cavalier or swordsman, depending on the place. And they're going to go fight and figure it out and solve a riddle and be given immortality. Now, Gideon is not really a cavalier, but she goes with her necromancer to face all these challenges. She's just a hilarious character, and a lot of the things she says are super funny, but for some reason I just found I wasn't that into it. I don't know. If somebody can let me know what they love, please tell me, because that might help me be inspired to go back to it, but I think it might have just been the wrong time to pick it up and not the book's fault at all. So that's it. That's my quarter year wrap up. 18 books, 2 of them DNF, 16 finished. One in progress right now makes book 19. I have a whole lot of books in my queue that I'm interested in reading coming up, but we'll see what the rest of the year brings. If you've got a book you recommend, please leave it in the comments, and if you've read one of these and your opinion differs, let me know. I'd love to talk to you about it. But remember, you might love what I hate and hate what I love, so make your own opinion. But thanks for listening to mine. Happy reading!